In 334 BC, a young man named Alexander marched an army of 30,000 Macedonians into battle against the most powerful empire in the world. The Persian king had assembled an army 5 times larger than Alexander's, but there would be no match for the 20-year-old Macedonian king, whose name would become synonymous with victory. Over the next decade, Alexander would fight more battles than any other general before or after him, and his relentless campaigns would take him to the furthest reaches of the known world. His victories reshaped the political map of the ancient world, forever changing the course of human history. And today, we're going to follow along as Alexander leads his army on campaign from Greece to India. This is the greatest general in history. Part 1. Alexander the Accursed. It's hard to overstate just how dominant the Persian Empire was when Alexander came onto the scene. After 2 centuries of near-constant warfare, the Persian king Darius III now ruled over an empire that stretched from Central Europe to Pakistan. The Persian Empire was the wealthiest, most powerful, and most militarized state in the ancient world, and it boasted some of the largest armies ever assembled. For decades, the Persian kings had been marching their armies north out of Iran in search of new lands and new wealth, and the last king, Cyrus the Great, had even managed to conquer Lydia, one of the richest states in Western Asia. Lydia was famous throughout the ancient world for its wealth and luxury, so much so that the Lydian gold coin became the standard currency of international trade. When Cyrus conquered Lydia, he gained control of unimaginable wealth and a huge influx of new talent and resources that helped turn the Achaemenid Empire into a superpower. But this empire was built on the backs of slaves and subject peoples, and as such, the Persians were not exactly beloved throughout their empire. Most of the people under Persian rule hated their conquerors and dreamed of the day they could throw off the shackles of oppression. Meanwhile, across the Aegean Sea, the Greek city-states had also grown tired of living under the shadow of the Persian Empire. A few generations earlier, the Persians had attempted to invade Greece itself and had nearly succeeded. But since then, the Greeks had reorganized and formed a defensive alliance to protect all of Greece from future Persian aggression. Leading this alliance was the Kingdom of Macedon, a small but ambitious kingdom on the northern periphery of Greece. Macedon had traditionally been ignored by the rest of Greece because they weren't very impressive. They were too poor to threaten anyone, and they were far enough away that they didn't really matter. However, in 336 BC, Philip II of Macedon changed everything. Philip managed to unite all the Greek city-states under the banner of Macedon and set his sights on expanding beyond Greece. Philip was assassinated before he could make good on these ambitions, but he left the throne to his son, the aforementioned Alexander the Great. Alexander ascended to the throne at just 20 years old, and he immediately began preparing for war against the Persians. He gathered allies throughout Greece and reorganized the Macedonian army. Now, thanks to his father's efforts, Alexander had the backing of most of Greece, but he still only had about 30,000 soldiers. As the year 334 BC rolled around, Alexander prepared to march his men south into Asia Minor, where they would meet up with the rest of his army and finally begin his war against the Persians. When Alexander marched into Asia Minor, he sent a message to the cities of Sardis, demanding their unconditional surrender. And to his surprise, the city's governor agreed. You see, Sardis was a rich and prosperous city, and its citizens weren't eager to participate in a pointless war against the seemingly unstoppable Macedonian king. So they surrendered without resistance, giving Alexander full control of Western Asia Minor. It should come as no surprise that the first thing Alexander did was to use the riches of Sardis to bolster his own treasury and increase the size of his army. Then he moved eastward and did the same thing to the cities of Ephesus, Halicarnassus, and Phoenicia. Each city fell without a fight, and soon Alexander had defeated every single city in the western part of Anatolia. And best of all, none of his soldiers had even died in the process. But Alexander knew that the real war was about to start. Soon enough, his army would have to face off against the full force of the Persian military machine. And if his troops hadn't already faced a serious challenge, they might not be up to the task. Now that Alexander had consolidated control over western Anatolia, it was time to move east and confront the Persian king Darius III. As he marched his army further and further east, Alexander began receiving messages from the Persian emperor calling for submission. At first, these messages were polite, but they quickly turned hostile as Darius realized that his calls for submission were being ignored. Finally, Darius decided that he had had enough, and he began mustering his forces for war. Darius assembled a massive army and marched them west to confront Alexander. However, he was forced to stop on the banks of the river Granicus, where he learned that the Macedonian had already crossed into western Anatolia. Darius had little choice but to chase down the fleeing Macedonian, which meant that Alexander got the jump on the Persians and was able to position his forces on the high ground overlooking the battlefield. When the two armies met, the Persians charged up the hill, confident that they would easily defeat the Macedonians. However, they were met with a storm of arrows and javelins that decimated their ranks. Then the Macedonian cavalry charged down the hill and completed a total rout of the Persian infantry. The Persian cavalry fared no better, and soon the entire Persian army was in full retreat. Alexander's forces suffered only light casualties in the battle, and the Macedonian king had proven himself to be a masterful commander. Now that Darius had been defeated, Alexander had free rein to finish conquering the rest of Anatolia. He spent the next 3 years systematically crushing every Persian city in Anatolia, securing his hold over the region and setting the stage for his invasion into Egypt. On his way east, Alexander made a brief stop in the Egyptian city of Memphis, where he was proclaimed pharaoh and given the traditional Egyptian crown. Meanwhile, back in Persia, Darius had taken the throne only to find that his empire was crumbling all around him. The governors of Babylon and Susa revolted and refused to pay their taxes to the king. And by 330 BC, Alexander had advanced into the heartland of the Persian Empire. As Alexander neared the Persian capital of Persepolis, the royal governors panicked and fled to the mountains. One by one, each city fell to the relentless Macedonians, and soon Alexander found himself at the gates of Persepolis. The city's governor offered little resistance, and soon Alexander had complete control over the richest city in the Persian Empire. With Persepolis in his hands, Alexander was essentially the master of all of Western Asia. All that stood between him and world domination was a small mountain range called the Himalayas. But Alexander wasn't done yet, not even close. He still had dreams of reaching the edge of the world, and to do that, he would need to cross the Himalayas and march his army into India. Before we wrap up this episode, let's talk about why Alexander has two entirely different reputations in history. To the Persians, he was nothing short of a demon incarnate. His victories over the Persians were so humiliating that his name became synonymous with destruction. The Persians called him Alexander the Accursed, and if that sounds harsh, consider that even his statues were vandalized in Persia. Historians who studied under Persian tutors were taught that Alexander was nothing more than a brutal conqueror. However, in the West, Alexander was practically a god. His victories over the Persians were seen as liberating subject peoples from tyranny, and many Greek historians viewed Alexander as a great hero. To them, he was Alexander the Great. One story in particular has become a quintessential part of Alexander's legacy, the legend of the Gordian knot. According to the legend, King Minos of Crete was having a competition to see who could pull his chariot through a sacred grove. The winner would get his daughter's hand in marriage. Alexander entered the competition, but he struggled to keep his chariots under control. Just when it seemed like he would lose, Athena appeared and helped guide his team of oxen through the maze. But she only appeared to Alexander, so everyone else thought he had cheated. Angry that no one believed him, Alexander made a sacrifice to Athena, promising to build her a temple upon his return. Then he went back to the competition and drove his chariots through the sacred grove. When he emerged on the other side, his team of oxen were so exhausted that they dropped dead. This angered Zeus, who struck Alexander with a thunderbolt. And when Alexander complained to the oracle of Delphi, she told him that he would never know true love because of his pride. And sure enough, his wife, Roxana, would leave him shortly after he died. So now, it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite story about Alexander the Great? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, make sure to hit that subscribe button.